It began with a whisper, the kind of whisper that floats through the grand, echoing halls of history long after the people who spoke it have gone. In a dimly lit archive room, buried under stacks of sealed envelopes and fading parchment, an archivist came across a letter so unassuming in appearance that it could have been dismissed as another piece of royal correspondence. But the handwriting was unmistakable, an elegant, looping script that the world had not seen since that tragic night in Paris. The signature at the bottom confirmed what the archivist already suspected: Diana, Princess of Wales. Her letters had always carried a certain emotional charge, even in her most mundane notes. This one was different. It was dated months before her death, written on fine stationery, and addressed to none other than Princess, and a woman whose own place in the royal family had been one of stoic reserve, someone who rarely invited the public into her private thoughts. For reasons not yet clear, Diana had entrusted, and with something she had not written to anyone else. The envelope was sealed with care, yet slightly creased at the corners, as though it had been handled nervously before being sent. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. When the archivist slit open the envelope and began to read, the air seemed to grow heavier. Diana's words were deliberate, almost surgical in their precision, but underneath them was a current of raw, unfiltered emotion. In the middle of the page, a sentence leapt out, the kind of line that makes the heart race and the mind race faster. Diana recounted, in plain terms, a private conversation she had with Camilla. And in that conversation, according to Diana, Camilla had told her, almost casually, that life would be easier if Diana were out of the picture. For decades, there had been speculation about tensions between Diana and Camilla. Public interviews, leaked tapes, and unofficial memoirs had hinted at private hostilities. But never had there been such a direct account in Diana's own hand. Never an allegation so stark that it blurred the line between mere rivalry and something far darker. And now, years after both Diana's death and Camilla's controversial ascent to the role of queen consort, this letter had surfaced, not in the media, not in a tell-all book, but in the formal archives of the royal household. The timing of its discovery could not have been more volatile. Britain, still navigating its complicated relationship with the monarchy, had watched Camilla gradually transition from the woman who was once considered the third party in a royal marriage to the partner of the reigning king. Many had accepted her. Some had even grown to admire her public service. But those fragile gains were suddenly under siege. The letter, once authenticated, was immediately classified as potential evidence. The whispers in the corridors of power turned to murmurs in the press, and the murmurs became a roar online. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to imagine the scene behind closed doors. In one wing of the palace, King Charles sat with advisors, reading a photocopy of his late ex-wife's handwriting, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. In another, Camilla's team scrambled to formulate a response, knowing that silence could be interpreted as guilt and denial could ignite a legal and media firestorm. The royal lawyers debated privilege, precedent, and the question no one wanted to say out loud: if a statement written in a letter could be grounds for criminal charges. For Princess and the recipient of the letter, the emotions were far more personal. Those who know her say she is not easily shaken. A lifetime of royal duty has trained her to keep her composure no matter the crisis. But there was something different about reading Diana's words again, all these years later. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the vulnerability between the lines. Diana had written to her as a sister-in-law, perhaps even as a friend, in a way that was rare in the royal household. She had entrusted her not just with a grievance, but with a warning. From the moment the letter's contents became known, the stakes shifted. The British press, always eager to pounce on any royal intrigue, framed it as Diana's final truth bomb. Social media erupted with hashtags calling for justice. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered, holding up enlarged photos of Diana and placards demanding Camilla's resignation, or worse, her arrest. Within days, what had started as a historical curiosity became a full-blown legal crisis. In the world of law, words matter. And when those words come from someone whose life ended under mysterious and controversial circumstances, they carry even greater weight. The Crown Prosecution Service, after reviewing the letter, determined it warranted further investigation. Legal experts debated whether Diana's account could be treated as admissible evidence, while historians warned against conflating history with hearsay. Still, in the court of public opinion, the verdict was already leaning heavily against Camilla. The arrest came quietly, without the flashing lights and handcuffs that tabloids would have craved. Official statements described it as a formal questioning under caution, but the word arrest spread faster and stuck harder in headlines. Overnight, decades of carefully managed public relations around Camilla's image began to unravel. The air of calm dignity she had cultivated was replaced by a narrative of suspicion and betrayal. And yet, the letter itself, its paper, its ink, the emotional cadence of its words, was not just a legal weapon. It was a time capsule. Every sentence pulled the reader back into the fraught 1990s, when Diana navigated a marriage collapsing under the weight of public scrutiny, personal betrayals, and a media circus that seemed intent on consuming her. Reading it now, you could feel the isolation she must have felt, the sense of being cornered. And you could also feel her defiance, the refusal to go quietly into that night. But there's another dimension to this story, one that makes it more than just another royal scandal. This wasn't a public diary entry meant to sway the masses. This was a private letter, sent to someone who had no reason to share it with anyone else, unless circumstances demanded it. Which raises a question that lingers like a shadow over the entire affair. Did Diana know this letter might one day serve as a weapon? Was it a deliberate insurance policy against a future she feared? As the investigation deepens, the unanswered questions multiply. How did the letter stay hidden for so long? Who else knew of its existence? And what, if anything, did Camilla say in her defense during those hours of questioning? The palace has released no further details, and those closest to the king have adopted a posture of dignified silence. What's certain is that this single piece of paper, written in a quiet moment between two women of the same royal household, has shaken the foundations of an institution that prides itself on permanence. In the weeks to come, alliances will be tested, reputations will be tarnished or defended, and the public will be left to decide whom they believe. The late princess who captured their hearts, or the queen who has fought for decades to secure her place at the king's side. This is not just a story about a letter. It's about the past catching up with the present, about words that refuse to die with the person who wrote them. And before we reach the end, you'll see why this revelation could change not just how history remembers Diana and Camilla, but how it remembers the monarchy itself. The room was colder than it should have been. It was not the sort of cold that made you shiver, but the kind that seemed to seep into your bones when you realized the gravity of what you were holding. Deep within the royal archives, behind a locked wooden door that had not been opened in months, a single desk lamp cast its glow over piles of aging correspondence. The archivist on duty had been assigned a meticulous but monotonous task, cataloging old letters for a digital record. Many of these envelopes contained harmless pleasantries, seasonal greetings, or thank you notes from decades past. That was until he came across one envelope, cream-colored, slightly warped with age, bearing a name that made his breath hitch. The address was unmistakable. It was written with precision and elegance, in handwriting once so familiar to the British public that it could be recognized instantly. Diana, Princess of Wales. The addressee was just as striking. HRH, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne. For a moment, the archivist simply stared, unsure whether to even touch it. The seal was intact, but worn at the edges. Something about it felt deliberate, as though the sender had chosen this paper, this envelope, and this recipient with the utmost care. Following protocol, the archivist recorded the find before carefully slicing open the envelope. The paper inside was thick, the ink slightly faded but still sharp enough to convey urgency. He began reading, expecting perhaps a private note of affection between sisters-in-law, or a reflection on family events. Instead, what unfolded on those pages was something far more consequential. The words did not meander. They cut straight to the heart of a private and explosive confession. Diana had written about a conversation that had taken place in the confines of royal walls, a conversation that could not have been imagined by those who saw only the staged smiles and polite exchanges. In this account, Diana described confronting Camilla directly. It was not angry in tone, but unervingly calm. the kind of calm that comes when a person has exhausted every other means of understanding and is left with nothing but truth. According to Diana, Camilla had, in an unguarded moment, said that life would be easier if Diana were out of the picture. The archivist froze at that line. It was not just the phrasing, it was the implication. Coming from a royal spouse, it suggested something beyond rivalry, a cold calculation about the absence of another human being. Protocol dictated that any historically significant document be flagged immediately. But this was more than history. This was a potential trigger for a legal storm, and the archivist knew it. Within hours, the letter had been removed from the archive and transferred into the custody of senior palace officials. The discovery was documented, photographed, and locked away in a secure case. Yet the very act of moving it from the dusty shelves to a guarded chamber set in motion a chain of events no one could reverse. In the following days, whispers began to circulate in certain corridors of power. The archivist, bound by confidentiality, said nothing publicly. But the royal household is a place where secrets are almost impossible to contain. Someone talked. Perhaps it was an assistant who saw the transfer, or a staffer who overheard the phone calls between the archives and the king's private secretary. Within a week, the knowledge of the letter had traveled beyond the palace gates. It reached individuals who understood its potential, not just as a historical artifact, but as a weapon. Princess Anne was contacted almost immediately. She had no idea the letter was still in existence. When it had first arrived all those years ago, she had read it, stored it privately, and eventually believed it was lost in the shuffle of decades. To see Diana's handwriting again, so vivid and so personal, was a jolt, and was known for her stoic temperament, for never showing more emotion than duty allowed. But those close to her say that when she reread the letter in full, she closed her eyes for several minutes before speaking. It was not grief she felt, it was recognition. Recognition of a truth she had known privately, but never imagined would be brought into the open. For those handling the letter, the next question was clear. Should it remain private or be turned over to authorities? The answer came quickly once legal counsel was consulted. In an era when historical crimes and past events were being revisited with fresh eyes, the words on that page could not be ignored. The police were quietly notified. Specialists in handwriting and historical document authentication were called in. There was no doubt about its authenticity. The style, the ink, and the paper matched other verified letters from Diana's private collection. The day news of the letter's discovery reached the media was the day the entire dynamic shifted. Reporters descended on London, camera crews camped outside the palace gates, and headlines screamed of a royal scandal that could eclipse any that had come before. But the frenzy outside was nothing compared to the storm inside. King Charles was informed of the letter's contents in a closed meeting, his face reportedly pale as he read the lines over and over. In another part of the palace, Camilla was summoned to meet with her advisors, her voice firm but her hands betraying a faint tremor as she denied the account. She argued that Diana may have misinterpreted a remark, that words could be twisted in the heat of conflict. But the damage was already done. Once the public had heard the line, life would be easier if you were out of the picture, the nuance was lost. The archivist who found the letter was quietly reassigned to another department, partly to shield him from the press, and partly to remove him from the heart of the chaos. Behind the scenes, every move was now being monitored. Legal experts debated whether the letter could be used as evidence in any formal proceeding. Some argued it was hearsay, others that it was a first-hand account worthy of serious investigation. For the public, the debate mattered less than the symbolism. To them, this was Diana speaking from beyond the grave, her voice finally unfiltered and undeniable. By the end of that week, the decision was made. The letter would be handed over to investigators, and Camilla would be questioned under caution. It would not be a televised spectacle, but the very act of summoning the queen consort for questioning sent shockwaves through the country. The monarchy, which had survived centuries of wars, abdications, and scandals, was once again facing a moment that threatened to redefine its image. And at the center of it all was a single piece of paper that had sat silently for decades, waiting for its moment to speak. This was not just the day a letter was found. It was the day the past walked back into the present, wearing the unmistakable handwriting of a woman who had been silenced too soon. In the tapestry of royal relationships, Few threads were as understated yet resilient as the one connecting Diana, Princess of Wales, and the Princess Royal. On the surface, they seemed worlds apart. And the no-nonsense daughter of Queen Elizabeth II had earned a reputation for her forthrightness, her almost brusque efficiency, and her lifelong devotion to duty without fanfare. Diana, in contrast, was a luminous figure who commanded public attention with grace, charm, and an ability to connect emotionally with strangers. Yet beneath their public personas, there existed a private understanding, one shaped by the unique burdens of royal life and the quiet need for someone who truly understood. Their bond did not develop overnight. In the early years of Diana's marriage to Prince Charles, and kept a polite distance, she had seen new royal brides before and understood that the adjustment to palace life could be grueling. But she also recognized in Diana something she herself had experienced in her youth: the challenge of navigating a family that operated under rigid tradition while being under relentless public scrutiny. Over time, formal exchanges became private conversations, and those conversations grew into a confidential channel that bypassed the usual filters of palace staff, and had always been pragmatic about the monarchy. She did not indulge in the romanticized notions the public often projected onto royal life. When Diana began to feel the crushing weight of expectation, coupled with the deep personal strains in her marriage, and was one of the few people who could offer advice without judgment or flattery. She was not there to coddle. She was there to speak plainly, to tell Diana hard truths when needed, but also to listen without the intent of passing what she heard to others. That made her a rare ally in a world where loyalty was often conditional. The depth of their trust was tested in private moments away from the cameras. On family retreats at Balmoral, where the winds off the Scottish Highlands seemed to carry away the noise of the outside world, Diana and would sometimes walk the grounds together. Their conversations ranged from the frustrations of royal protocol to personal hopes for their children. And a mother herself understood the fierce protectiveness Diana felt toward William and Harry. She also understood the challenge of shielding them from the very institution they were born into. The letter at the center of the current scandal was not the first Diana had written to Anne. In fact, a small handful of notes had passed between them over the years, often after particularly difficult events. These letters were not grand manifestos. They were human exchanges between two women who, despite their differences, shared a deep and sometimes painful understanding of their positions. When Diana wrote the now famous account of her conversation with Camilla, she did so knowing that and would grasp the significance instantly. This was not a casual complaint. It was a statement meant for someone who could measure its weight. Anne's reaction to receiving that letter years ago had been shaped by her own experiences with public and private conflict. She had faced criticism in the press, endured scrutiny over her own relationships, and weathered moments where her character was dissected by people who had never met her. She knew the cost of speaking out and the greater cost of remaining silent. That may have been why she kept Diana's letter private for so long. To release it then would have been to throw an already fragile family into deeper turmoil. But to destroy it would have been to erase a truth that might one day matter. Their relationship was also bound by an unspoken agreement. What passed between them stayed between them unless circumstances changed so drastically that silence was no longer the honorable choice. Over the years, Anne had seen plenty of stories about Diana distorted or fabricated by the press, and she had no desire to feed that machine. But she also carried the knowledge of what Diana had endured, and that knowledge, locked away in her own memory and in the pages of that letter, became a kind of silent promise. Outside of the family, few understood the quiet solidarity between the two women. The press rarely paired their names together, and public events often showed them engaged with others rather than each other. This, perhaps, was intentional. To cultivate a visible closeness would have invited speculation and intrusion. Their bond was preserved precisely because it was kept private. It was in the quieter settings, a side table at Sandringham, a shared glance during a tedious ceremony, that their understanding revealed itself. In retrospect, those who knew them both have said that Diana's choice to send that particular letter to Anne was not only logical but inevitable, and was the one person who could be trusted to neither sensationalize it nor dismiss it. She was the custodian of a truth too dangerous for the public at the time, yet too important to be lost. That responsibility weighed on, and in ways she rarely allowed herself to admit. Every time she thought of the letter, she thought of the woman who had written it, the vulnerability in her eyes, the determination in her tone. When the letter resurfaced in the archives decades later, it was as if their private connection had been pulled into the open without warning. For Anne, the moment was both painful and vindicating. Painful because it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Vindicating because the world could finally see what she had known all along. That Diana's struggles were not exaggerated or imagined, but rooted in words and events that had truly occurred. In the days following the rediscovery, and maintained her usual public composure. She attended engagements, shook hands, and smiled for cameras as though nothing in her private world had shifted. But those who caught her in quieter moments noticed the difference. A reflective pause before answering questions, a certain distance in her gaze. It was as if she was carrying the weight of two timelines, the past where the letter had been written and kept secret, and the present where its existence had detonated into a national crisis. What bound Diana and was not just shared circumstance, but mutual respect for the burdens each bore. Their friendship was not about constant companionship or overt declarations of loyalty. It was about knowing that, in a world where appearances were everything, there was at least one person who could see behind the curtain. That knowledge made the letter more than evidence. It made it a testament to a bond that endured even after death. It was a damp evening in London, the kind where the city seemed to hold its breath under a blanket of low, heavy clouds. Inside the palace walls, the light was softer, the corridors quieter, but the stillness carried tension. Diana had been waiting for this moment for months, perhaps even years, the moment when she would speak directly to the woman who had, in her eyes, played a central role in unraveling her marriage and reshaping her life. Camilla was no stranger to whispered accusations, but face-to-face confrontation was a different matter entirely. The setting for their meeting was not a formal drawing room or a public engagement. It was a private sitting area, removed from the constant flow of staff and visitors, a place where words could be exchanged without fear of being overheard. Or so it was thought. Diana had chosen it carefully, aware that the fewer people who knew of the conversation, the less chance there was for it to be twisted or leaked before she had the chance to process it herself. Diana entered the room with a calmness that belied the storm she carried inside. Her posture was upright, her expression composed, but her eyes told a different story. They were steady, unflinching, and quietly defiant. Camilla was already there, seated in a high-backed chair, her demeanor unreadable. She did not rise to greet Diana. The air between them was not hostile in the loud, argumentative sense. It was the kind of hostility that comes from two people who know exactly what the other represents and what is at stake in every word spoken. Diana began without preamble. She spoke of her marriage, of the emotional strain, of the persistent feeling that she was living alongside an unspoken third presence. She did not raise her voice, but the precision of her words cut sharply. She was not there to seek reassurance. She was there for clarity. Camilla listened, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze steady but not warm. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured, almost casual, as though discussing something far less consequential than the future of a marriage or the emotional survival of a young mother. According to Diana's account, it was during this exchange that Camilla made the remark that would etch itself into her memory forever. Life would be easier if you were out of the picture. The words were delivered without theatrics, without an obvious sting in the tone, and perhaps that made them even more chilling. They were not shouted in anger or whispered in secrecy. They were presented as a statement of fact, an observation rather than a threat. But to Diana, the meaning was unmistakable. There was a moment of silence after the remark, the kind of silence that magnifies everything that came before it. Diana did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let them reveal themselves in the spaces between breaths. In that pause, 1,000 thoughts crossed her mind. The years of public duty, the private sacrifices, the constant battle to hold her ground in a relationship that seemed to have been negotiated around her rather than with her. She realized in that instant that no reconciliation, no polite coexistence, would erase what had just been said. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady, but the warmth had drained from it. She told Camilla that such a sentiment was not just cruel, but dangerous. Dangerous because it laid bare the way she was seen not as a person, but as an obstacle. She reminded her that she was the mother of the future king and that her presence was not negotiable. Camilla did not argue the point directly. Instead, she shifted the conversation to practicalities, as though sidestepping the remark entirely would make it dissolve. But Diana was not in the mood to be redirected. The confrontation continued for several minutes, the two women circling each other verbally, testing boundaries without crossing into outright shouting. Diana's questions were pointed. Did Camilla believe that her own happiness outweighed the duty and stability of the crown? Did she think that history would look kindly on the role she had played in reshaping the life of the Prince of Wales? Camilla's answers, though restrained, hinted at an unshakable conviction that her bond with Charles was something unassailable, something that had always been there and always would be. For Diana, the conversation was less about winning an argument and more about taking stock of the reality she was facing. She would later reflect that this was the moment when the last traces of illusion fell away. There was no more hoping that the dynamics could shift in her favor, no more pretending that the playing field was even. She understood now that the challenges she faced were not just the result of circumstance, but of deliberate choices made by people who saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a partner in the shared life of the monarchy. When she left the room, she did not slam the door or exchange final barbs. She simply walked away, carrying the weight of the exchange with her. The corridor seemed longer, the air heavier. She knew she would have to process what had just happened, but she also knew she could not do it in the open. That night, she began writing the letter to Princess Anne, the letter that would preserve this conversation in ink and ensure that, if ever the truth needed to be told, it could be told in her own words. What struck her most in the hours after the confrontation was not just the cruelty of the remark, but the ease with which it had been delivered. It spoke of a certainty that her removal, in whatever form, would simplify things for others. It was this certainty, more than the remark itself, that told Diana where she stood. And so, she wrote it down, not as a cry for help, but as a record, a safeguard, a way of making sure that history would know what she had heard and from whom. The confrontation was over in less than an hour, but its echoes would travel through decades. It was the catalyst for the letter, the seed of a scandal that would not bloom until long after Diana's death, and the private moment that now stands at the center of a crisis shaking the monarchy. The letter itself was not long in the way official documents can be, but it carried a density of meaning that made every line feel heavier than the paper it was written on. It was composed on cream stationery, the kind reserved for private royal correspondence, with Diana's familiar, fluid handwriting sweeping across each page. There was no ornate language, no unnecessary flourishes. Her style in the letter was direct, yet elegant, every sentence balanced between restraint and urgency. The opening was polite, almost deceptively so. She began by acknowledging Princess and in terms that reflected both respect and familiarity. Diana knew that to deliver the weight of what she was about to say, she needed to frame it not as a rant, but as a considered and intentional record. She recounted a brief outline of the evening, naming the setting and the reason for her conversation with Camilla without dwelling too much on peripheral details. This was not meant to be gossip. It was meant to be testimony. When she reached the moment of Camilla's remark, "Life would be easier if you were out of the picture," Diana wrote it exactly as she remembered hearing it. She even noted the calmness in Camilla's voice, a detail that changed the tone entirely. The remark was not born of a heated exchange or the slip of an uncontrolled temper. It was delivered almost conversationally. Diana underscored this distinction in her writing, emphasizing how the casual delivery made it more chilling than if it had been said in anger. She described the silence that followed, how it stretched just long enough to register that the comment had been intentional. Diana's words conveyed the physical sensations of that moment, the way her chest tightened, the way her thoughts sharpened into a clarity that cut through years of confusion. She wrote that she had looked directly into Camilla's eyes before responding, and that in that exchange of glances, she understood something she had long suspected, that she was seen not as a person, but as a problem. Throughout the letter, Diana was careful not to accuse without context. She acknowledged the complexity of her marriage, the mistakes she herself had made, and the public pressure that had magnified private struggles. But she did not shy away from the reality that her life had become entangled with individuals who believed her absence would make their own positions easier. She made it clear that this was not about petty jealousy or personal dislike. It was about the safety of her position, her children, and her dignity. There was a section in the middle of the letter where Diana reflected on the role of women in the royal household. She wrote about how, despite the grand titles and privileges, the women often found themselves positioned as chess pieces, moved or removed according to the needs of others. She contrasted this with her public role, where she felt a deep responsibility to connect with ordinary people and represent them with empathy. This contrast, she implied, was at the heart of why she and Camilla could never see eye to eye. Diana also addressed why she was writing to Anne specifically. She explained that she trusted Anne's discretion and her understanding of what it meant to endure the pressures of royal duty. She said she wanted someone in the family to have the unfiltered version of events, not the polished account that might appear in the press or the one shaped by palace advisors. She hinted that she feared, should anything happen to her, the truth might be buried or rewritten to suit the needs of those still living. Toward the end, her tone shifted from documentation to something more personal. She wrote of her sons, of her determination to remain present in their lives, and of her unwillingness to let anyone dictate her place in their future. She expressed concern that the dynamics surrounding her could one day impact them in ways they would not fully understand until they were older. The remark from Camilla, she suggested, was not just about her. It was about removing a mother from her children's daily world. The final paragraph was short but resolute. She thanked Anne for reading and for keeping the letter safe, no matter how much time passed. She did not instruct her on what to do with it, only asked that she remember its contents and the sincerity with which it was written. The closing signature, Diana, Princess of Wales, was penned with her usual flourish, but even here there was a subtle difference. The ink pressed slightly harder into the paper, as if sealing her resolve into the page. Holding the letter now, decades later, one could feel the tension embedded in the paper. The handwriting carried a rhythm that betrayed both composure and urgency. The choice of words revealed a mind that was clear, deliberate, and fully aware of the implications of what was being set down in ink. It was not an emotional outburst dashed off in anger. It was the careful preservation of a moment that Diana knew might one day matter more than anyone could imagine. When investigators read it for the first time, they reportedly sat in silence for several minutes after finishing. The weight of those words, combined with the historical and personal context, made it impossible to dismiss. It was the sort of letter that could not be read without hearing the voice of the woman who wrote it, a voice now forever absent, yet still capable of shifting the ground beneath the monarchy. This letter was not merely correspondence. It was a statement, a warning, and, perhaps unknowingly, a spark that would ignite a crisis years after the hand that wrote it had been stilled. And as it left the archives and entered the realm of legal and public scrutiny, its role shifted yet again, from a private message to a sister-in-law, to a piece of evidence that could alter reputations, relationships, and even the future of the crown. To fully understand the magnitude of Diana's letter and the shockwaves it sent through the monarchy, it is essential to revisit the royal climate during the time it was written. The early to mid-1990s were a period of quiet storms and public upheavals within the House of Windsor. On the outside, the monarchy projected its usual image of continuity and tradition. But inside the gilded walls, relationships were strained, alliances were shifting, and the balance between public perception and private reality was growing increasingly fragile. By the time Diana sat down to write to Princess Anne, the marriage between her and Prince Charles had already reached a point of deep fracture. Publicly, there were still joint appearances, staged photographs, and carefully managed statements meant to preserve the illusion of unity. Privately, each was living a largely separate life. Diana had begun to redefine her role, focusing her energy on humanitarian work, hospital visits, and causes that connected her directly to the public. Her popularity was soaring, not just in Britain but globally, and she was increasingly seen as the most relatable royal, a status that both strengthened her influence and deepened the tension with those inside the palace. The monarchy at that time was also dealing with a series of other challenges. Prince Andrew's personal life had drawn tabloid attention. Princess and had divorced her first husband, and the Queen was navigating the complexities of modernizing an institution steeped in centuries of tradition. There was a growing awareness that the public's tolerance for royal missteps was not infinite, and every headline carried weight. Against this backdrop, any internal conflict had the potential to spiral into a public relations disaster. Within this charged environment, Camilla Parker Bowles was already a name whispered in connection to the heir to the throne. While their relationship was not officially acknowledged, it was an open secret among certain circles. The press had begun to sharpen its focus on her, portraying her alternately as a long-standing confidant to Charles and as a threat to the royal marriage. For Diana, this was not merely a matter of perception. It was an intrusion into her personal life that carried emotional and political consequences. Every public event that required her to stand alongside Charles felt like a performance layered over private hurt. Inside the palace, there was no shortage of quiet diplomacy aimed at keeping the peace, but the efforts often leaned toward preserving the monarchy's image rather than addressing the personal toll on those involved. Diana's grievances, while acknowledged in certain quarters, were often handled with the hope that she would adapt, as generations of royal spouses had been expected to do. But Diana was not built to silently endure. Her openness, her emotional honesty, and her willingness to speak candidly, even if only in private, set her apart from the more reserved members of the family. It was during this period of fragile equilibrium that the confrontation with Camilla occurred, and it was into this climate that Diana's letter was born. The context magnifies the letter's importance. It was written not at a time of public fallout, but in the middle of a cold war within the family. That she chose to record the incident at all speaks volumes about her understanding of the palace environment. She knew that without a tangible record, the truth could easily be reshaped, minimized, or buried altogether. The institution's unspoken rule had always been to avoid open conflict within the family, especially when it involved those in the direct line of succession. Disagreements were meant to be smoothed over, not documented. For Diana to break that code, even in a letter intended for private safekeeping, was an act of quiet defiance. It was a recognition that the forces around her were not merely indifferent to her struggles, but potentially aligned against her. There was also a cultural shift happening beyond the palace gates. The British public in the 1990s was beginning to demand more transparency from its institutions, including the monarchy. The media's appetite for royal stories was insatiable, and the line between public duty and private life was blurring. Diana, perhaps more than anyone else, understood how quickly narratives could be spun and reputations recast. Her decision to write down her account of Camilla's remark reflected both personal instinct and an acute awareness of the times she lived in. Camilla's position in this context was complex. She had her own network of support, her own defenders who saw her as a victim of circumstance and long-standing affection. But she also faced intense public hostility, much of it fueled by the perception that she was undermining the future of the monarchy by disrupting the marriage of the heir apparent. The remark recorded in Diana's letter, whether intended as a literal wish or a thoughtless comment, carried the potential to confirm the harshest views of her critics. The Queen, as always, maintained her public neutrality. She had navigated decades of family disputes without allowing them to spill into open view, and she was not about to change course. But those who served her understood that the stability of the monarchy depended on managing both perception and relationships. The emergence of a letter like Diana's, one that could not be publicly denied without further inflaming curiosity, would have been seen as a direct threat to that stability. This was the royal landscape at the time, a family holding itself together under the strain of multiple fractures, a public increasingly aware of the cracks, and individuals within the institution weighing loyalty against self-preservation. It was a climate where every private word carried the potential to become a public reckoning. And in that environment, Diana's letter was more than a personal note to a trusted sister-in-law. It was a deliberate act of record-keeping in a house where truth was often the first casualty. Understanding this context makes it clear why the letter's rediscovery decades later carried such explosive power. It was a fragment of a larger struggle, a piece of evidence from a time when the monarchy was already navigating dangerous waters. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, It has become a lens through which the entire era can be re-examined. One remark, one confrontation, and one piece of paper that refused to be forgotten. It began not with a press conference or a deliberate act of disclosure, but with the smallest ripple in a tightly controlled pool. The existence of Diana's letter was supposed to remain confined to a circle so small it could be counted on one hand. At the moment it was rediscovered in the archives, it was passed only between the archivist who found it, the palace official tasked with handling sensitive historical material, and Princess and herself. Yet in a place where every corridor has ears and every movement can be observed, secrecy is an almost impossible feat. The first crack appeared in an unexpected place. A casual conversation between two lower-level staff members whose jobs overlapped just enough for them to share workspaces. One of them had seen a folder being couriered to a secure office late at night, its contents guarded with unusual seriousness. The other had heard snippets about a historic letter from a trusted colleague who was meant to remain silent. Neither knew the full truth, but speculation thrives in the absence of detail. By the time the whispers reached someone with knowledge of the royal press operations, the story had already taken root in half-truths and curiosity. Palace press officers are trained to sniff out potential leaks before they become stories, but this was different. What had been discovered was not just sensitive, it was incendiary. Those who knew the exact contents understood that if even a fragment reached the outside world, it could ignite a storm that no amount of carefully worded statements could contain. The problem was that each person who learned of it became a potential point of failure, and in a system as vast as the royal household, controlling that many potential failures was an almost impossible task. The turning point came when a journalist known for cultivating palace insiders received a vague but tantalizing message from one of his contacts. A reference to a letter from Diana about Camilla that was locked up for now, but too big to stay hidden. The journalist, seasoned enough to know the difference between idle gossip and a genuine lead, began probing discreetly. He asked questions without asking questions, using the language of implication to see who would bite. Within a week, he had spoken to 3 separate people, none of whom should have known anything, who each confirmed, in their own limited way, that something remarkable had been found in the archives. The palace realized the story was slipping from their control. Meetings were held to decide whether to get ahead of the leak or attempt to smother it. The danger of going public was obvious. Once the letter's contents were acknowledged, they could not be retracted. But the danger of silence was equally clear. If the media ran with an incomplete or distorted version of the story, the palace would have no credible way to correct it without confirming the core truth. The decision, for a time, was to remain silent and monitor the situation. It might have worked had it not been for the fact that curiosity is a force no institution can fully suppress. The journalist, after weeks of chasing the thread, managed to obtain a description of the letter's key line. Life would be easier if you were out of the picture. It was only a paraphrase at first, but it was enough to capture attention. The words were unmistakably personal, unmistakably pointed, and unmistakably dangerous if attributed to Camilla. Once that fragment reached the newsroom, the process accelerated. Editors debated the ethics of running the story without seeing the letter itself. Legal teams assessed the risk, but the appetite for a headline that connected Diana, Camilla, and a direct accusation was too great to ignore. The first article appeared in a Sunday paper, carefully couched in phrases like allegedly and reported to have said, but the implication was clear. The story did not claim to have the letter in hand, yet it hinted strongly that palace sources had verified its existence. The reaction was immediate. News outlets across Britain picked it up within hours, and by the next day, international media had joined the chorus. Social media amplified it tenfold, with hashtags calling for accountability, justice for Diana, and questions about the Queen Consort's position. The palace's initial silence, intended as a shield, was interpreted by the public as confirmation. Inside the royal household, the mood shifted from containment to damage control. Phones rang constantly, emails flew between legal teams, and security protocols were tightened to identify the source of the leak. The list of suspects was depressingly short, yet impossible to narrow with certainty. Those who had handled the letter directly swore they had said nothing. Those accused of passing on fragments denied it with the sort of vehemence that can be genuine or practiced. The leak had done more than just reveal the letter's existence. It had shifted the balance of power. By forcing the palace into a reactive position, it gave the media and the public the upper hand. Now it was no longer a question of whether the letter existed, but of when its full contents would be made public, and under what circumstances. Each day that passed without an official statement allowed the narrative to evolve in ways the palace could not control. And yet, amid the frenzy, one fact remained constant. The letter itself had not been seen outside a very small circle. The words were still under lock and key, their exact phrasing known only to those who had physically held the pages. But the leak had done its work. The idea of the letter. The image of Diana putting pen to paper to record such a remark had taken on a life of its own. For the public, that was almost as powerful as the real thing. The royal household could only watch as speculation became conviction, and conviction became outrage. What began as a whisper in a quiet archive had now roared into a storm that was no longer theirs to control. The outrage did not build slowly. It erupted like a dam giving way. The morning after the Sunday paper printed its first report about the letter, Britain woke to a media landscape saturated with the story. Television news anchors repeated the same phrases over and over, carefully framed to avoid legal trouble, but potent enough to stir the public imagination. A letter from Diana, addressed to Princess Anne, allegedly recounting a remark by Camilla that life would be easier if Diana were out of the picture. The words themselves became a refrain that carried across the airwaves, newspapers, and digital headlines, searing into the national consciousness. By midday, the pavements outside Buckingham Palace and Clarence House had filled with people. Some came simply to see if the royal family would respond. Others brought flowers, photographs of Diana, or handmade signs demanding justice. A handful carried placards with Diana's image overlaid with the word truth in bold letters. The air buzzed with a strange mix of grief, indignation, and almost theatrical anticipation. The story had not just reopened old wounds. It had ripped them wide apart. The public's reaction was not uniform. There were those who defended Camilla, arguing that the comment might have been taken out of context or misinterpreted after decades. But those voices were quickly drowned out by a much louder chorus. People who had never fully accepted her as queen consort, who saw in the letter's words the confirmation of everything they had always suspected. Social media became a battlefield. Hashtags like Justice for Diana, Out of the Picture, and Not Our Queen trended simultaneously. For those who had lived through the 1980s and 1990s, it was a reminder of the years when the Wales marriage dominated headlines and public sympathy overwhelmingly tilted toward Diana. Internationally, the reaction was just as fierce. In the United States, morning shows dissected the report in detail, often framing it within the broader narrative of Diana as the people's princess betrayed by the very institution she had married into. In Europe, newspapers published archival photographs of Diana and Camilla, placing them side by side in layouts that needed no commentary. In Australia and Canada, where ties to the monarchy still hold symbolic weight, political commentators debated whether this renewed controversy could reignite Republican sentiments. The outrage also carried a generational split. Older Britons who had once viewed the monarchy as untouchable found themselves questioning its moral authority. Younger people, already skeptical of hereditary power, seized on the story as evidence that the monarchy was out of step with the values of accountability and transparency. The notion that a private letter could implicate a sitting queen consort in such a personal and hurtful remark struck many as incompatible with the dignity the role was supposed to represent. Palace aides could feel the shift in the air. They had seen public backlash before, but this was different. It was more sustained, more emotionally charged, and less willing to be soothed by platitudes. The fact that the outrage centered on Diana, a figure who remained beloved decades after her death, meant that the palace was fighting not just a news cycle, but an enduring legacy. Every image of her smiling with children, embracing the sick, or speaking candidly about her struggles was being recirculated alongside the alleged remark, reinforcing the perception of her as a victim of coldness and indifference. Outside St. James's Palace, a woman in her 60s stood holding a framed photo of Diana from the day she visited a local hospital. She told reporters she had kept it on her mantle for nearly 30 years and had come to London because she felt the truth had finally been spoken. "It's what we all thought," she said, her voice breaking. Now we know she knew it too. Her sentiment was echoed by countless others who saw the letter as vindication of their long-held beliefs about the way Diana had been treated. Not everyone in the crowd was emotional. Some were strategic. Activist groups saw an opportunity to push for broader change, organizing petitions to have certain royal privileges reviewed and calling for more transparency in palace affairs. Their leaflets, handed out to passers-by, connected the outrage over the letter to broader questions about the monarchy's role in a modern democracy. While many signed simply out of anger over the story, others began to consider the implications more deeply. The royal family's public calendar began to thin. Engagements that had been planned for Camilla were quietly postponed, with official explanations citing scheduling conflicts. Yet everyone understood the real reason. The risk of her being confronted in public by protesters or heckled during appearances was too great. This absence only fueled speculation. The more she stayed out of sight, the more people began to believe she had something to hide. Television pundits, sensing the story's endurance, began hosting nightly panel discussions. Former palace staff, biographers, and journalists who had covered Diana in her lifetime were invited to weigh in. Some described the remark as devastating but unsurprising. Others speculated on how the late princess might have responded had the story broken while she was still alive. A recurring theme emerged: the belief that Diana's greatest strength had been her ability to connect directly with the public, bypassing the palace machinery. A strength that now, even in death, seemed to be speaking louder than official statements. By the end of the first week after the leak, polls showed a noticeable dip in public approval for Camilla. While Charles's own numbers had not dropped as sharply, analysts warned that prolonged silence could erode the broader standing of the monarchy. The outrage had not burned itself out. Instead, it had settled into a simmer, the kind that could be reignited with the smallest spark, especially if new details of the letter emerged or if Camilla's response was perceived as evasive. The public was no longer content with speculation. They wanted to see the letter in full. They wanted answers about why it had been hidden for so long, and they wanted to know what, if anything, the royal family would do in light of its contents. Until those demands were met, the outrage would not fade. It would simply wait, poised for the next revelation. Inside Clarence's house, the atmosphere was suffocating. The walls themselves seemed to absorb the tension, as if every whispered conversation, every hurried footstep, left an imprint. Camilla had weathered storms before: whispers, accusations, moments when the public glare turned harsh and unforgiving. But this felt different. This time, the accusations weren't born from rumor or speculation. They were tied to the written words of a woman whose memory the public guarded with near religious devotion. Diana was no longer just a former princess in this narrative. She had become the voice of truth from beyond the grave, and Camilla found herself cast in the role of the antagonist. The first cracks in her position appeared in the form of canceled engagements. At first, they were explained away with vague references to scheduling conflicts or the need for private time. But everyone inside the palace knew the real reason. The risk of public scenes was too high. In the weeks prior, the carefully cultivated image of Camilla as a warm, approachable queen consort had been undone in a matter of days. Crowds that once greeted her with polite applause now threatened to confront her with signs, questions, and even jeers. In the court of public opinion, her silence was read not as dignity, but as avoidance. Behind closed doors, the legal implications of the letter began to take shape. The fact that it had been written decades earlier did not shield her from scrutiny. Prosecutors were careful in their language, referring to the matter as an investigation into historical conduct rather than a straightforward criminal case. But the mere fact that her name was linked to an active inquiry was devastating. Her legal advisors pressed her to issue a statement, something to challenge the narrative before it became fixed in the public's mind. But the palace communications team feared that speaking out too soon could backfire, locking her into a defense that might unravel if new details emerged. King Charles, too, was caught in an impossible position. As husband, his instinct was to protect her. As monarch, his duty was to safeguard the stability of the crown. The more public anger swelled, the more it became clear that the two roles might not be compatible. Advisors close to him quietly floated contingency plans, measures to reduce her public role temporarily, or to shift focus toward other members of the royal family. Even the suggestion of such moves signaled just how precarious her position had become. Inside Camilla's private circle, loyalty was beginning to waver. Those who had been her staunch defenders now faced pressure from their own connections and the media. Friends declined invitations to social gatherings, wary of being photographed in her company. Charities she supported began to distance themselves, not with outright rejections, but with delays and vague excuses about timing. For someone who had worked for years to overcome her past reputation, this slow erosion of support felt like a betrayal all over again. The most damning blow came when whispers emerged that investigators had interviewed multiple palace staff members from the time of the letter's writing. While no public statement confirmed this, it was widely believed that at least one of them had corroborated elements of Diana's account. Not necessarily the remark itself, but the atmosphere, the tensions, and the private animosities that had made such a conversation believable. In the public's mind, that was enough. Camilla's absence from public life became a story in itself. News outlets tracked her movements, speculating about her mood, her health, and whether she was still living full-time at Clarence House or spending more time at one of the quieter royal residences. Every photograph of her was analyzed for signs of strain. The once confident figure who could navigate a hostile press with a tight smile now seemed diminished, her expressions guarded, her posture less assured. The palace tried to redirect attention by releasing carefully curated images of other royals. William and Catherine attending engagements, princess and performing her duties with unwavering dedication. But the tactic only deepened the perception that Camilla was in retreat. The absence became symbolic, a void in the monarchy's public presence that the media was only too eager to fill with speculation. When the news finally broke that she had been formally questioned by investigators under caution, the reaction was swift and unforgiving. The palace statement described it as a necessary procedural step, but to the public, it was an arrest in all but name. Commentators debated whether the monarchy could withstand such a scandal without permanent damage. Polls showed a sharp decline in her favorability ratings, with a significant portion of respondents expressing doubt that she should remain queen consort at all. Inside the royal household, some saw the situation as irreversible. Even if she were cleared of any legal wrongdoing, the court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. The idea that a queen consort could be implicated, even indirectly, in such a personal and damning account from Diana was incompatible with the image the monarchy needed to project. The crown had survived affairs, divorces, and abdications, but this was different. It was a clash between the living embodiment of the monarchy's present and the enduring ghost of its past. Camilla understood the danger better than anyone. She knew that, in the public imagination, Diana's voice carried a moral authority that hers never could. Every day that passed without a resolution was another day in which that authority grew stronger, while her own position weakened. And as the investigation moved forward, the walls of protection she had built over decades were beginning to crumble, stone by stone, under the relentless weight of memory, public sentiment, and the unyielding words of a letter written long ago. The announcement came on a gray morning, one of those damp London days when the sky hangs low and the city feels muted. At exactly 9 a.m., the Royal Communications Office released a statement to every major news outlet in the United Kingdom. It was short, formal, and tightly worded, written in the careful, almost archaic style the palace favors when addressing matters of great sensitivity. Yet for all its restraint, it carried the unmistakable weight of a response the world had been waiting for. The first paragraph acknowledged the widespread public interest in the recent reporting regarding a private letter written by Diana, Princess of Wales, to Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal. The language was deliberate. The letter was reported to exist, not confirmed outright, a subtle attempt to leave a sliver of doubt. The statement went on to assert that the royal household remains committed to supporting the work and dignity of all its members, and that the queen consort has always served with the utmost integrity and dedication. But the next part was the most telling. It addressed the investigation without naming the agencies involved, describing it as an ongoing review into historical matters of a private nature. The phrasing was designed to remove any sense of immediacy, to frame the situation as something belonging to the past rather than a crisis in the present. Nowhere in the statement did the palace confirm the exact words attributed to Camilla, nor did it deny them outright. This omission was intentional. To deny risked sparking further demands for proof. To confirm was unthinkable. The final lines called for restraint and respect for the privacy of all individuals concerned, urging the public to allow the process to unfold without speculation. For those inside the palace, it was a carefully calibrated move, enough to show that the crown was not ignoring the uproar, but not so much that it boxed them into a definitive position. For the public, however, the statement read as evasive, the kind of polished non-answer they had grown accustomed to in times of royal scandal. Within minutes of its release, newsrooms across the country dissected the wording. Analysts pointed out that while the palace had managed to avoid any explicit admission, its very decision to issue a statement suggested the matter was serious enough to demand one. Commentators on television and radio parsed every clause, debating whether the queen consort's integrity and dedication line was an attempt to shield her from blame or a signal that the king intended to stand by her no matter the public backlash. On social media, the reaction was swift and unforgiving. Many saw the statement as confirmation that the palace was protecting one of its own rather than addressing the substance of the allegations. Memes and edited clips began circulating, comparing the palace's call for restraint to past scandals where silence had been used as a tool to control the narrative. Hashtags calling for the full release of the letter surged again, this time accompanied by demands for a televised address. Inside the palace, the drafting of the statement had been the subject of intense debate. In the days leading up to its release, senior aides and legal advisors had gathered around a long table in a private meeting room, going over draft after draft. Some argued for a firm denial, believing that public opinion could be swayed if Camilla's voice was forceful enough. Others insisted that denials without evidence would only invite further scrutiny and could backfire if more details from the letter became public. The king's own input was measured but decisive. The statement had to be brief, respectful, and final, at least for now. Camilla herself had read and approved the final draft, though those present noted her reluctance. She was not a stranger to public criticism, but the knowledge that the words of Diana, a figure she could never truly escape in the public's mind, were now being poured over by millions left her visibly unsettled. The omission of a direct denial, she feared, would be interpreted as weakness. Yet she also understood the risk of saying too much in a climate where every syllable would be scrutinized. The king, for his part, appeared calm in public, but was described by aides as deeply troubled in private. The monarchy's image, already a delicate construct, was being reshaped by a decades-old document. His decision to approve the statement without defending his wife in more explicit terms was not a sign of doubt in her, they insisted, but a recognition that the institution came first. To tie the crown's reputation too closely to hers at this moment could imperil them both. In the hours after the statement's release, the palace's public affairs team tracked coverage from around the world. In the United States, the tone was skeptical but restrained, with networks noting the lack of outright denial. In Europe, the coverage was sharper, portraying the palace as clinging to formality in the face of a moral reckoning. In Australia and Canada, commentators debated whether the monarchy's continued reliance on opaque language was compatible with modern expectations of accountability. Yet despite the global discussion, the statement did little to calm the storm at home. Protesters remained outside the palace gates, undeterred by the drizzle. Their signs now carried new slogans, many of them direct responses to the palace's call for restraint. Among them, one stood out, large white letters on black cardboard reading, "We've been restrained long enough." By the day's end, it was clear that the official statement had not closed the matter. If anything, it had hardened public demands for transparency. The words had been carefully chosen to protect the monarchy from immediate damage, but in doing so, they had left the most important questions unanswered. And those questions would continue to echo until either the letter itself was made public or the investigation reached a conclusion, whichever came first.